many of you watching this video have watched Game of Thrones? If I would guess, I would say at least 60% of you have watched Game of Thrones. I would bet, okay, I don't really have that much, but could bet almost everything that I have that number is probably accurate. I'm a very disgruntled Game of Thrones fan. I defended this show all my life. Every time the arguments came up in my real life about the GOAT TV show, I was always on the side of Game of Thrones, always defending this show. But after the last 2 seasons, I just didn't identify as a Game of Thrones fan anymore. I just couldn't. Like, if you mention Game of Thrones near me, I don't talk. I just shut the hell up. Unfortunately, I have to talk about Game of Thrones in this video. I've always known that, spoiler alert for those that have never watched it, the Red Wedding was loosely based on a true life story that happened in Scottish history. So I'm really looking forward to this video. Let's get right into it.
Blackfriars Priory, Scotland, February 20th, 1437. King James I of Scotland reclines in a bedchamber with his wife Joan of Beaufort and her servants, relaxing after a hard day of tennis, when suddenly there's a commotion outside, and the royal couple rises to discover a large group of men storming the building. James hurries to lock the door, but finds the bar missing. He then tries the windows, but they won't open. Oh no, has his bedchamber been tampered with? Oh, it had. And at that moment, his trusted chamberlain is leading a group of assassins to the room. Desperate, James pries up a floorboard and attempts to scramble into a sewer he knows runs below. Meanwhile, at the door, servants try to delay the assassins. One even places her arm in the rung of the locking bar, but the attackers slam against the door until her arm snaps, forcing it open. They spot the broken floorboards easily. Meanwhile, down in the sewer, the king despairs as he's now trapped. He'd forgotten he'd ordered the drain blocked because he kept losing tennis balls down it. And there, the King of Scotland dies.
I mean, is this really like, this doesn't sound like the true story. Tennis balls. Were there tennis balls during that period in Scottish history? I don't think so. This has to be made up. Can't be real.
The chain of revenge is set. The Black
Dinner.
The infamously brutal event that was the historical inspiration for the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. But to tell that sort of tale, we need to get the setting right. So, think of a harsh landscape of castles and wilderness, racked by political feuds, and populated by powerful families not afraid to get their hands bloody. Welcome, in other words, to late medieval Scotland. As we covered up top, in 1437, a rival political faction murdered King James I in the sewer below Blackfriars Priory. But the assassins made one basic mistake. They didn't kill James's wife, Joan of Beaufort. Though injured, she somehow survived and escaped. And you know, funny enough, the ex-Miss Stewart was, let's just say, less than thrilled about her injuries and the murder of her beloved husband. So, as soon as she was able, she put out a hit of her own on the assassins. And you know, just so we can speed through this story's appetizer and get to the main course, this is where we cue a lot of dead assassins. But while Joan got her revenge, her son James II was still a child. In fact, he'd only turned 7 the day after his father's sewer killing and was therefore too young to assume the throne. No big deal, though. The young James and his mother were allied with Archibald Douglas, 5th Earl of Douglas. Famed as the Black Douglases, the Douglas clan were the most powerful noble family in Scotland. They'd risen to prominence in the early 14th century as loyal supporters of Robert the Bruce, the king who bested the English in Scotland's War of Independence. Ever since then, the Douglases had been acquiring land and prestige, expanding their power base in southern Scotland. So basically, they were the last family you wanted to make an enemy of, and the first one you wanted on your side, especially if you were a vulnerable boy king. And Archibald Douglas would have surely kept young James safe and, you know, compliant with his own interests, were it not for one small problem. In 1439, 2 years after James II became nominal king, Archibald died from a fever. His heir was William Douglas, who was himself only 15 years old and hardly a fit guardian for the young James. So in swooped the enemies of James II and his mother Joan, specifically one William Crichton, the powerful Lord Chancellor of Scotland. Crichton essentially kidnapped James, saying he would be the young king's new guardian until he came of age. In reality, though, Crichton kept James as a comfortable prisoner in Edinburgh Castle, a brooding stronghold that perched atop the rocky crag overlooking Scotland's capital. You said it, bud. Anyway, in 1440, the young William Douglas received an unexpected summons. James II, with permission from his so-called guardian Crichton, had invited him for dinner. As was customary, the Douglases were promised safe passage. Attending feasts was a common way for the nobility of the period to meet, interact, and conduct the business of state. So both the 16-year-old William Douglas and
Basically the same thing as Game of Thrones. They were promised safe passage. That one is, man, that is crazy. That's like thinking of that particular scene right now. I'm just picturing that thing happening in real life. That is brutal. That is absolutely brutal.
his younger brother, the 12-year-old David Douglas, accepted the offer, setting off through the wind and rain of a Scottish winter. Edinburgh Castle, November 24th, 1440. The great hall resounds with merriment and feasting. The wine is flowing, the hearth is glowing, and the first main courses have already been consumed. At the high table, the young King James is playing host to the two other youths, the brothers William and David Douglas. And James is enamored by the pair, enjoying their company. None have the first inkling as to what's about to happen. Servants begin to carry out the feast's main course, but as the crowd catches sight of it, the sounds of excitement and rejoicing fade, and the courtly music goes silent. The food, placed before William and David Douglas, is no tasty delicacy, but rather the severed head of a black bull. King James and the young Douglases stare at it in shock, all knowing the symbolism. For in Scotland, the head of a black bull is an omen symbolizing one thing: death.
Whoa. Death.
Shouts
Wow.
and screams break the edgy silence as men grab William and David. James rises too, protesting voraciously, but he's ignored. Helpless, and their pleas unheard, the two young guests are dragged out of the feasting hall. At William Crichton's command, William and David Douglas are hauled to Edinburgh's place of execution on Castle Hill. Given a brief mock trial, they are found guilty of plotting against the
Mock
very
trial.
king who, moments before, had been enjoying their company. And without more words, the two boys are beheaded. The killings shocked Scotland, not only as acts of
Whoa.
infanticide, but also because they violated the customs of hospitality that
Hospitality, yeah.
underpinned medieval Scottish life. To invite a fellow noble into your hall was to promise them safety and protection. Therefore, the murder of the young Douglases was a betrayal of the highest order. But just who ordered it, and why? Of course, as the public face of the killings, William Crichton was obviously involved, but he wasn't the only one. There were other nobles with gains to be
So William Crichton is like, it's like the original story. Like it's like the Game of Thrones version of Walder Frey. Oh man, that is actually interesting. So this man, this Game of Thrones creator just sat down and looked at this story. Basically, almost the same thing. Almost the same thing here. Seriously, that is mad.
But just who ordered it, and why? Of course, as the public face of the killings, William Crichton was obviously involved, but he wasn't the only one. There were other nobles with gains to be made following the deaths of William and David Douglas, and none more so than the boys' great uncle, James Douglas. Yep, as in any good story of medieval intrigue, it was likely the scheming uncle who was behind it all along.
So in the Game of Thrones story, it will now be Roose Bolton, because Roose Bolton was like the second in command behind Robb Stark. So all this is I'm saying is for people that have watched Game of Thrones, obviously. So if you have not watched Game of Thrones, I'm really, really sorry for all this jargon I'm speaking. But yeah, so Roose Bolton would be the version of the trusted uncle, though he was not the uncle of Robb Stark in the show, but he basically played the same role in this particular story.
James Douglas, known as James the Gross, stood to inherit the lands and titles in the event of his nephew's sudden demise.
Yeah,
we
same
assume
thing.
the plan for what would become known as
Same thing as the Boltons, becoming the rulers of the North.
the Black Dinner was subsequently hatched with Crichton and possibly a few others, though they covered their tracks well, likely in secret meetings with furtive messages to leave no hard clues about their involvement. But in truth, the outcome showed James Douglas's hand clearly enough. Once the unfortunate boys met their end and were disposed of in an unmarked Edinburgh grave, James the Gross became the 7th Earl of Douglas and one of the most powerful men in Scotland. But now you might be asking, just how much of the detail in this story is true? Well, as with so much from this period, it's hard to be absolutely certain. The closest we've come to a primary source is the Auchinleck Chronicle, which says only that William Douglas and his younger brother David were put to deed, or put to death. Whether there was a treacherous dinner featuring a bull's head isn't mentioned. However, later medieval and Renaissance writers started to include it in their histories, sometimes describing the animal omen.
Was it made up? Probably it was made up. Who knows? Most of the stories are, okay, let me not say most. Lots of the stories that we hear about history was written by people. So we don't really know exactly what happened play by play. We just don't know. Some part of it might have happened, but probably some of these writers, history writers or historians, probably, put some spice and some salt in the stories to make it taste better.
As a black boar instead, and the account was cemented by famed author Sir Walter Scott, whose 19th century novels essentially created the medieval Scotland we imagine today. But whatever the truth of that night, the Douglas brothers' murder seemed to have a lasting effect on the young King James II. He survived his troubled upbringing and eventually turned the tables on the villainous James Douglas's son. Fittingly, King James II invited William Douglas, son and inheritor of the murderous James Douglas, to a feast in Stirling Castle in 1452, 12 years after the Black Dinner of Edinburgh. During the banquet, James and a number of other men sprung up and attacked Douglas, stabbing him 26 times before they, according to the Auchinleck Chronicle, struck his brains out with a poleaxe and tossed his body out a window. It seemed the ghosts of William and David Douglas finally had their revenge on the family of their treacherous great-uncle. The Black Dinner has made for a dark, compelling story for over 5 centuries, a blend of fact with a likely pinch of fiction. Yep. And like all dramatic historical events, it spawned other tales, including some taking place in the realms of the fantastic. And Scotland is rife with such stories, weaving a rich tapestry that runs from the past into the present. And whether the exact details of the Black Dinner are true or not, one thing is for sure. Today in Scotland, severed bull's head remains decidedly off the menu. And running...
Obviously, they've probably spiced up the story a bit. Like, I don't think everything that happened was this dramatic. I don't think so. But it makes for a very great story, and it was very, very, very well depicted in Game of Thrones when the show was still great, obviously. Not the time that it became shit. Anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Have you ever heard of this story before? Have you watched Game of Thrones before? What do you think about the show? Am I overreacting about me abandoning the show, basically? Let me know what you think if you're a Game of Thrones fan, because I really, really, I'm done. I couldn't even watch House of Dragon. That is how annoyed I am. I couldn't even watch I can't. There is no spin-off that will come out. Probably the next spin-off that will come out of Game of Thrones that I'll probably watch would be Robert's Rebellion. Probably. Or maybe Tywin Lannister's time when he was younger. I don't know. Maybe the Lannister house, because I love the Lannister house. Outside of that, man, I just couldn't watch it. Everybody was hyping House of Dragon. One of my friends that was also a Game of Thrones fan was telling me, look, go and check it out. It's great. Go and check it out. I said, no, I just can't watch it. I just can't. I am Game of Thrones as a franchise. It's dead to me. Anyway, I'll see you on the next one. Peace.